Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Okay. Um, Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening. Welcome to the CSIS program on Biden administration's China policy and transitioning to a new approach. I'm Scott Kennedy. I'm Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS, and we're delighted to have all of you with us today for this discussion. We are in a new era. Now, China has its new era, the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. I'm not thinking of that. Ours might be something like Joe Biden's thought on unity with American characteristics for a new era. This is the very first event on US-China relations held by a DC think tank in the new era. And like the administration, we want to get to work right away. We're going to try and grapple with two big questions in this hour. The first is, how much room for maneuver does the Biden administration have? The general sentiment seems to be that they are hemmed in by several forces. The first is an ideologically rigid, repressive, and aggressive China, and one that grew last year by 2.3%, and according to the IMF is going to grow like 8 to 9% this year. And yesterday, Beijing issued a notice banning 28 Americans from China and punishing organizations that work with them. And might that be the start of a new harder line from Beijing? In addition, Trump administration adopted 200 plus unilateral actions on China in the past year, which could box the new administration in. You've also got Congress, which has no love lost for China, which had over 380 pieces of legislation introduced in the 116th Congress about China, and many of those are going to be reintroduced in the 117th. And then you've got our allies in Asia and Europe who are ambivalent. They still don't want to pick sides, and without the crazy uncle in the White House, quote unquote, they may now feel less threatened by the US to do deals with China. Or as one told me recently, we may not be able to wait on the US to get its house in order. Given all of that, the second question is, what should the US do? What should the Biden administration's policy be? Now, luckily, I have three superstars, super smart and creative minds joining me today to discuss this problem. They are non-resident experts with our program. They're well-rested, rejuvenated, and going to help us through to understand all of this. Claire Reade, who was former assistant USTR for China, Dan Rosen, who's the founder of the Rhodium Group, and John Holden, who directs the China practice for McLarty here in Washington. The four of us are going to offer some initial thoughts on these issues, and then I'll moderate a Q&A during the second half of the program. You all can submit questions online via the event webpage, and we've already started to see. I've already started to receive questions, but go back to the webpage and add more questions so that we make sure that we have as full a discussion as we possibly can. So let's get started. I'm going to offer some initial comments about the overall transition that I think the Biden administration is facing in moving from the Trump administration's approach to theirs. Now, my view on this may be a little bit different than most people, and in particular what I set out at the beginning about the ways in which China and other parts of the US government and the previous administration may hem Biden in. I think actually there's more room for maneuver than people give credit for. And let me explain why. The three reasons. The first is that it's clear to me that the Biden administration has a fundamentally different conception of international affairs and the US role in the world. It's a dangerous world, but it's not a Hobbesian world where we're all on our own and you can't depend on anybody else, and where unilateral action and even isolation may be better than engagement, which is, I think, how the Trump administration viewed the world. This administration has signaled very clearly that they believe in multilateralism, that there are important reasons to collaborate with others. They also view the international economy as a source of opportunity for the American economy, not just a danger or a threat. As a result, it seems to me that they view the contest with China as not just simply about relative power, but a clash of systems and different conceptions of the international order. You might call it the liberal international order versus the illiberal international order. As a result of this, the goals of the competition, how we compete, how we keep score, how we know when we're successful, all might be different under a Biden administration. Now, to shift, they're going to obviously need to deal with the Trump legacy, but it's not just a question of whether to keep or pitch this or that measure. It's much, much more. What we now see as weapons to drive decoupling may instead become tools for risk mitigation or defending the US-led order's underlying principles. The second reason why I think there's more room for change is that a lot of the tools that the Trump administration rolled out to deal with China, particularly on the defensive side, were originally created for a different purpose, for different times, and they were applied to the China case somewhat haphazardly. And those tools need reforming. Third, there's going to be a question. There's been so many measures adopted so quickly, we have to figure out how to sort through them so that you have a policy that is cohesive, coherent, and where all the different elements connect to each other. And so that's what I want to talk about for the next couple minutes, which is how do you sort through this 200 plus measures that the Trump administration adopted. Now, I put out a commentary a couple days ago that has this figure that's on the screen for all of you to see. That's my effort. It's not all 200, but it's the biggest ones. And so I categorize the policies into 4 different buckets. The first are what I call unilateral multilateralism. These are things I think I'd encourage the Biden administration just to change unilaterally. Don't need to negotiate with anybody. Get rid of the Section 232 tariffs, get out of the way of the appointment of the new Director General, candidate from Nigeria, rejoin Paris, signaled that the US is going to keep its troops in Europe and Asia, rejoin the World Health Organization, rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. Some of these things the administration already did yesterday afternoon and will be in the process of doing. Some of these they've signaled that they will. The lone question mark is the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum and whether they should be continued on China and Russia. I think against the rest of the world doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but China's got a massive steel and aluminum overcapacity problem, and Russia hasn't been very cooperative either. So we got to figure out how to deal with those overcapacity problems. But broadly speaking, these are things which the US should be able to do from day one. Second box, the exact opposite. Things that the US, again, can do on its own, but maybe be even tougher on China. And I think that applies to human rights issues with regard to Hong Kong and Xinjiang, where the Trump administration did a lot at the agency level, but the White House, the president, didn't really speak to these issues very much. I think there's some clear record of the president's indifference to questions of human rights. And there's a lot more that could be done to have a unified policy that's stronger and hopefully more effective. I think there's another category of items that have to be handled that fall somewhere in the middle. And I'd call these bilateral stabilization. These are things which probably a Biden administration wouldn't have thought of to do for themselves and probably don't think are necessarily in the US interest, but we're in a difficult position because of lack of reciprocity from China, real issues that animated these actions in the first place, the Section 301 tariffs, the expulsion of journalists, the closure of the Houston consulate and then the Chengdu consulate, the extradition case involving Miss Meng and the two Michaels who were taken hostage by the Chinese following Canada's holding of her, the TikTok and WeChat bans, and a couple other things. These are issues which I don't think the Biden administration should just roll back willy-nilly, unilaterally. To do so, they're going to need to have discussions with China to come to some arrangement that where we gain the type of reciprocity that is deserved or addresses the underlying concern that generated the US action in the first place. So for example, with regard to journalists, we shouldn't just accept, exchanging, visas again. American journalists operating in China faced increasing problems doing their jobs. And as we know, their staffs, like the Bloomberg staffer who's currently detained, been facing lots of problems. We have to try to reduce the level of Chinese interventionism that American journalists in China face. So these are things that need to be changed, hopefully, but they're going to require cooperation from China and more than they've been willing to do. The final category are what I call modified restrictions and reforms. These are areas where these may not have been the original tools that would have been everyone's favorite to use, or the Biden administration, but these are addressing real challenges that everyone agrees are problems with China. China's high-tech drive, cybersecurity, surveillance. A lot of these are in the tech space, and a lot of the things that the Trump administration did, the motivations made sense, but the specific policy tools weren't necessarily well designed to achieve these goals, and there wasn't enough coordination with allies to make it so that if we'd end up isolating China rather than ourselves. So there's a lot to do with regard to these, mostly in the tech space, but also in terms of international governance with the WTO, for example, making sure that we reform the WTO, not just hold it up, which is what we've been doing with the appellate body. We need to get the WTO to address big issues related to subsidies, how the appellate body acts, et cetera. And that's going to require more constructive, positive engagement with our allies across the board. So these are the ways I divide things up. And so it doesn't add up to just simply more or less decoupling. I really do think there's a possibility that the administration could really reconceptualize what they want out of the relationship with China and how it fits into their bigger picture. And so I think they've got more room than they think they do, or that others think that they do. Then the question is, can they get there? So that's just my point of view. I want to turn now to my colleagues and have them weigh in on these and other issues. We're going to start with Claire Reade, former assistant USTR for China, who's now with Arnold and Porter, and also luckily with our program. And she's going to talk about trade policy issues. What should we expect out of USTR and new US Trade Representative Catherine Tai, and how are they going to interact with the Commerce Department and others that have some effect on American trade policy? And what's the chances for rolling back the 301 tariffs or the 232s, export controls? If you had the reins, Claire, what would you do? So let's turn things over to Claire now.
Thank you, Scott. I'm having a little bit of an instability in my internet connection, so I think I'm going to keep my video off in an abundance of caution here, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So I think the Biden administration has made its view very clear that dealing with China is going to require an overall strategic vision and plan that crosses all the agencies and should be seamless, as opposed to having silos in individual agencies for what occurs. And I think it's clear that trade is viewed as one tool in that plan, but just one. I'll also say that the incoming USTR has made it very clear that trade is going to be a tool to benefit US workers and ordinary Americans in the US economy. I think a lot of that is indicating that there isn't that much sympathy for improving the trade of multinational corporations or other corporate interests. So I think that's a very important perspective on how the options will be viewed in terms of viability and utility. A key premise in my thinking is along the lines of what Scott said, which is that China is really a major market that the United States can't simply jettison. Not just talking about the size of our trade, which is not, so overwhelming that we have no choice, but there are many indirect adverse impacts on the United States if we tried to leave the market wholesale and the rest of the world stayed in, which they're going to. The second premise is that China's trade with the rest of the world can create very serious problematic distortions, as well as in certain areas, genuine national security concerns. And that means that the Biden administration is going to believe that steps will be needed to be taken to safeguard against damage to the US future from China. All right, so with that context, what trade actions are needed? We would need to try to work to remove distortions and deficiencies that hurt the United States' ability to grow, to compete in global markets, and to participate in a reasonable way in the China market. So leveling the playing field as much as we can. The Biden administration has been very clear in its rhetoric that we need to use allies to work on China matters. I think that's true. I think that's true in the trade space, but I think we will also need to use our own resources, since I think relying on allies are going to have limits and it's going to take much more time than anyone thinks. Obviously, not on a trade front, but, perhaps the best approach that the United States has strategically vis-a-vis China is for us to, work at home and do the kinds of things on the domestic front, like worker safety nets and infrastructure and the like, that will actually allow us to be a clean and efficient competitor. Okay, with regard to trade, though, I also think it's important to understand that no major trade actions are likely to occur until the White House clears it as part of the overall China strategy. Now, the White House players on China have been announced, and they trend towards national security and military political expertise. Now, that makes the trade actions a more open lane for the trade agencies, or it may also create a sense that trade is not a prime tool that needs to be used right away. And so therefore, it's kind of put on the back burner and people aren't listened to. But USTR is very well educated on how China works, and it's headed by a very savvy China watcher in Catherine Tai. So I think they are ready and creative and savvy and politically attuned. In terms of the interagency, I would anticipate that the State Department may play a more active role than they have, given some of the folks in state on China, and that you will always have Treasury involved in the admixture of micro versus macroeconomic concerns. I think the Commerce Department will probably play a role as normally an ally of trying to, improve U.S. exports and the perspective of U.S. businesses and workers trying to make headway in China. What can we do? What does the landscape look like? Well, obviously, there's a bilateral China trade deal that's already signed and committed. Going to need to make clear that China is going to continue to need to meet those deal conditions. This is, I think, a political imperative domestically inside the United States. And I think it's an important signal of both persistence and strength to China. And by the way, it is an existing source of leverage, and it should not be hastily jettisoned. So we have issues under the phase one part of this China trade deal that are where Chinese implementation is pending and should be pressed with regard to intellectual property commitments, for example. And what the media tags frequently the seriously lagging Chinese purchase commitments. Now, they may have made about 60% of what the commitments entailed. There clearly were some serious problems created by COVID, but this needs to be addressed. And it also creates leverage. It promised to do this. Now, the next question is phase two. Is there a phase two option that should be considered as viable? I think it behooves the US administration realistically could be gained in an ambitious effort under phase two. There was a lot of discussion, I believe, in the big broad negotiations that ended up culminating in the phase one deal about what the other issues were at hand. And if there is a sense, problems could be addressed, or a collection together significant of market access opportunities could be gained, or more effective intellectual protections and enforcement, things that would actually level a playing field and bring China more into the mainstream of best practices, that could be worthy. That needs to be evaluated. And obviously what the United States would give in return also needs to be assessed, because the phase one trade deal did not have a lot of heavy lifting from the US side. But if reduction of tariffs is one of the quid pro quos, obviously you need the US economic analysis, value of that in terms of potentially creating a win-win situation, given the damage that tariffs does to US economic growth. So overall, I think there's an advantage potentially of an existing channel here where there has been genuine cooperation and perhaps an opportunity for further pragmatic trust building if China doesn't try to manipulate it. But China would be very unwise, in my view, to try to tee up an offer of dialogue or an offer of improvements in what they're already doing. In terms of allies, I think that's longer haul. I think there are more facets to the actions that need to be taken. And I think it's been clear that there are going to be no mega trade deals up front for sure. On steel tariffs, I think it may be more realistic to think about working with allies to rework those arrangements so that you're better creating the wall against the Chinese excess capacity without intended bad economic consequences. I think it's very politically difficult to pull down those tariffs. In terms of national security issues and infrastructure, supply chain investment, allies make a lot of sense here. And I think we should try to take parallel steps with them after we work through our strategic assessment. Same for technology export controls. Very complex, but it's not going to work if the US tries it on alone by itself. Inside the WTO, finally, definitely can work on distortive subsidies, excess capacity, tech transfer. Good to lay that groundwork for rules, but obviously inside the WTO, China can block consensus and have allies join them. So you need to figure out, and it's going to take a while, how to create leverage to set rules with consequences among major trading partners. Maybe you're looking at plurilaterals at some point. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you, Claire. That's tour de force covered a lot of ground on trade and economic issues, personnel, policies, allies, the WTO. Really fantastic. Let's turn now to Dan Rosen, who's the founder of the Rhodium Group and a longtime partner of our program. Has come out with terrific reports with us on China's financial system. And they're just, Rhodium Group is just way ahead of everybody looking at Chinese investment in the US, the Europe, and so many issues. Dan, it's great to have you today. And hopefully you can give us some sense of your view about China's economic recovery, whether that gives that more leverage vis-a-vis a struggling US, and where do you think China's state capitalist strategy is taking the country the mountaintops or to a crisis. And if you were giving advice to the Biden administration, how would you suggest they handle these challenges?
Awesome, Scott. So great to be here with you and John and Claire and the group on this first day of the new era. Indeed, the things that you suggested I try to address are a little more contextual. They kind of describe the field on which this cooperation, competition, et cetera, is taking place. Claire is a practitioner, more operational. John, more operational. I'm going to be a little bit, high and above the ground, but hopefully it'll be useful. So the first question you put to me, does China's quick recovery confer leverage on it vis-a-vis a US that's still in the weeds? And Lord knows we are. In the immediate moment and the quarters ahead, the answer is absolutely. They have the ability to run circles around us right now. We're sitting dead in the water and they've got 2,000 horsepower Mercuries on the back of their boat relative to where everybody else is. But let's look at the nature of that economic dynamism that they have right now. Part of their recovery, part of their numbers for 2020 were a result of a last minute decision to change the numbers for 2019 and make them smaller to make the year-on-year change look a little bigger. That's the sort of stuff which, they don't really need to be messing with the data right now to look better than everybody else, right? So it kind of seems like a petty, silly thing to do, to give economists like you and me the responsibility to point that out. That's part of it. Most of their performance in 2020 is real and tremendous accomplishment, given the challenges the rest of us are having dealing with the pandemic all over the planet. But it results from taking over the role of the market back to the government, even more than trend. And trend was concerning to us all, right? We've been talking about this for years, Scott. The kind of statist leaning was concerning in general. 2020, even more so. And what that means is that the underlying efficiency of the economy gets even worse. When government people are sent in to do the job, it means you're no longer driving based on productivity. And one of the things we look at Rhodium is something called an incremental capital output ratio. It's how much money gets thrown at the economy to get 1 unit of GDP growth thereafter. And a good number is like 3 to 1. China has been messing around at like 6 to 7 in recent years. 2020, it's gone to 9 renminbi just to get the same 1 renminbi of growth that they used to get for $3 of investment, or renminbi of investment, right? So that's just an acid test of data that says this is not sustainable here the way they're currently doing it. The rest of their big numbers this past year are, of course, the result of an absolute record trade surplus with the world, a world that's on its back feet when China was able to get its factories restarted thanks to its laudable pandemic control. But there's nowhere for that trade surplus to go but down now, and it has kicked hornets' nests all over the planet that are going to be an additional headwind coming into this new phase here. People uncomfortable with China's trade surplus position. So set to the second point then, Scott, is Xi Jinping's statism, his state capitalist strategy, is it really going to work for China going forward? Well, even in Beijing, the preaching that we hear is that the party is going to bring a big new market allocation reform program to bear. We were told about that last April. We didn't get a lot of detail, but apparently that's still being formulated. They're going to have a market allocation mechanism for everything from land to labor to capital to data. What have we been doing the past 40 years, if not marketizing all that stuff already? I don't understand why we're still preaching that there's going to be this big bang of marketization as though we were back in 1970, 78. So they're talking that talk, but then when we look at all the specific policy areas, they are clearly slipping backwards into a more state-directed mode rather than a market driven mode. In the Central Economic Work Conference back in December, reform got fourth place on the list of priorities for the coming year, with indigenizing China's supply chains and dual circulation and all that stuff getting higher billing. Xi Jinping's own goals, remember, at the start of his tenure, as Joe Biden thinks at the start of his, Xi's own goals were to avoid this kind of statism and to have a more decisively market direction for China's future. This is clearly Plan B that China and Xi are using right now. It's not where he intended things to be as we come up to the party's whether this takes China into a crisis or not going forward, well, that remains to be seen. The Chinese people are willing to tolerate a lot of state, heavy-handed statism in their system, it's fair to say. But we do know that this kind of economic model cannot produce something anywhere close to 5% GDP growth for China on average out over the next half decade. It's going to have to be a much lower number if the state makes all the decisions. So finally, then, to finish up, is there any way for President Biden to mitigate some of the risks that we would identify resulting from that Chinese system and Chinese situation as we just described it, rather than just saying decoupling, decoupling, decoupling as the prior government did? The first risk of China's system is that our misperception of its success tempts us to screw up our own system, right? That because we haven't been able to beat them, we're going to join them in too much industrial policy, too much state intervention in the marketplace and whatnot. And you bet Joe Biden can mitigate that risk. And I think he's already started to do so. His message has been one of calm, of taking the necessary time, of looking at evidence, of listening to analysts again, rather than shooting everything from the hip. We need to, and he knows we need to, both walk and chew gum. We're going to need to disengage with some aspects of China's system if China continues to make it more statist, right? While preserving the benefits we enjoy from keeping as much as possible that is not strategically problematic for us open and flowing. Secondly, Joe Biden can prevent bad policy choices, not just here in the United States, but worldwide, by respectfully, but honestly and directly pointing out the real weaknesses in China's economic system, in getting the narrative correct again, so that people aren't distracted thinking that democracy is on its last legs, and therefore they should be open to these illiberal sorts of ideas. Third and finally, balancing China's Faustian bargain offerings is not just about decoupling excessively from China, of course, but recoupling effectively with Europe, Japan, and other like-minded economies. A big part of the China problem that we've created for ourselves in recent years, you know, a lot of the insights around the problems with the Chinese system were correct. And delighted to see Tony Blinken and others in their confirmation hearings acknowledge that and say, we're not looking to throw out everything here, bathwater and baby, right? We're going to be selective about it here. The much bigger part of the problem was neglecting to appreciate the asset side of our ledger, which is our relationship with other liberal market democracies that are desperate to work with us to address common concerns about the way China's doing things. And Joe Biden's getting back to that already. Thanks.
Dan, terrific. Again, super duper helpful. Spurred a couple questions I want to come back to that actually I want to have everyone weigh in on. But let's now turn to John Holden, who's also non-resident expert in our program, runs the China shop for McLarty Associates, longtime veteran of China, on the ground in China, running businesses as well as trying to help promote constructive U.S.-China relations. So, John, I was hoping that you could help us understand the political side of all of this. Where is Xi Jinping in terms of his domestic political situation? Do China's actions with regard to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, wolf warrior diplomacy, is there any sign that Xi or China is going to run into a wall on these things, and we should expect turnaround in China eventually in a more liberal direction. And how do you handicap President Biden's political capital to deal with China in a relatively innovative way? So over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Scott. Great program. Pleased to be part of it. I'd just like to back up a little bit to talk about the overall context for China this year, which is, as Dan just mentioned, the 100th anniversary of the CCP. This is not a year where they're going to be changing course, right? This is going to be an affirmation of everything that they're doing. So I think you're right, Scott, in your analysis to say that domestic repression, state capitalism, and external assertiveness will continue this year. And what's behind that? I always think about Deng Xiaoping's edict, which was that stability trumps everything. Wending yadao yiqie. And for China, that's front and foremost in the minds of all leaders, from Mao to Xi Jinping. And what are the threats? Well, we saw in the transition between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, we saw a lot of chaos. The Bo Xilai affair, the downfall of Zhou Yongkang, etc., and a massive campaign of anti-corruption campaign that was instituted by Xi and continues. And the reason that perhaps the reason that market reforms are not front and center has to do with this need to insert the CCP everywhere, because it's the one tool that Xi Jinping believes he can count on. And we shouldn't underestimate the sense of wariness, perhaps even paranoia, of any Chinese leader. And you will recall Mao basically launched the Cultural Revolution to secure his own position. So that's super important. The other thing that I want to mention is the 2035 goals for China. The party designs these things and they're locked in. And what's part of this, in addition to being one of the core elements of that, is to raise living standards in China. Li Keqiang this year mentioned that 600 million people have incomes of less than 1,000 renminbi or less per month. That's a massive amount of people who are still a long ways from the middle class. And so this is something that they have to achieve. They have to improve on that. So I think, and the bargain with the population of China, on the one hand, yes, it's stability. Why the repression in Xinjiang? Well, because this sells well at home. Okay, there is almost no domestic pushback on the policies that a lot of Chinese think are necessary to prevent extremism. So the two goals, economic growth and stability, dominate everything. How will Biden manage to deal with all of this? Well, as you said rightly, Scott, it's an evaluation of where we are, and it's devising a strategy that's achievable, coherent, etc. The overall context, the political context in the United States is such that it's going to be, the China policy stuff is going to be part of the overall day-to-day negotiations with Congress that will also involve a whole bunch of domestic priorities. So how that three-dimensional chess develops is going to have some impact on Biden's freedom of movement vis-a-vis China. But I don't think they're going to be moving towards a softer position. I think they're going to be looking towards a more effective strategy vis-a-vis China. So I wanted to just offer a few thoughts in the remaining couple of minutes on some things that I think we should and shouldn't do. I don't know if we'll have time to suggest what China should do, but just a quick footnote on that. From a Chinese perspective, Wang Jisi is my go-to guy on U.S.-China relations, and he's just written a piece in Caixin, came out today, basically saying that the domestic agendas in both countries will prevent any significant change in U.S.-China relations. So yes, China will come, they'll try to negotiate with the U.S., and there are things that we'll be able to do, but we're not going to see a sea change in this relationship. But for the U.S. side, I would argue that we shouldn't push on an open door. And I would maybe take slight issue with the notion that we should be telling the Chinese how to reform their economy. I think we've been telling them that for 40 years, and they'll do it if they want to. So, if I'm a negotiator, I'll say, you guys, you think state capitalism is better for you? Well, go for it. You don't like what we're doing, fine. I wouldn't spend any airtime on that. I would focus on setting the rules for where China's actions intersect with ours and the rest of the world. Okay, so it's on trade, investment, territorial disputes, cyber, data, and of course, national security. These things we need to have understandings with the Chinese of what's acceptable, what isn't, and there have to be consequences that are credible. There's an interesting piece by Rob Atkinson. Many of you know him at ITIF. Just came out recently, where he called for something called DATO. It's a trade analog of NATO. It's a democratically allied trade organization. It's countries that will team up to resist actions against any one member. And we're thinking of Australia, for example. There are things like that we can do that recognize the weaknesses in the international trade system, WTO in particular, and may create the proper set of incentives and disincentives for China. I believe that we need to constantly maintain our military deterrence in Asia. That is essential. Lots to be done on that. I think that the Biden administration should speak out about values and should engage globally on these things. We have a story to tell. Our story isn't perfect, but we have something to offer here, and we need to be active in it and consistent. And then lastly, I think we do need to recognize that there will be discrete things that we can do with China. We should try to achieve them. We should, in doing so, build trust that's necessary for diplomacy on bigger issues. If you have no trust, no money in the bank, if you're in a crisis, you've got nothing to draw down on. So lots to do. A really interesting period in global history. That's all I've got, Scott.
Terrific, John. That was really, really helpful. You all set out a significant challenge that has many different elements to it. And we've received a lot of very good questions while you all were talking and in the days running up. Let me begin with one question for the three of you, if you guys don't mind. And I want to ask you all about how, when you're in a negotiation with another country or a company or whatever, you kind of have in your mind a summary of what you think are the core characteristics of the group on the other side of the table, right? So it's a guidelines that give you an expectation of what you think they'll do in certain situations. And my sense is that the Trump administration kind of had three guideposts that they used when they were thinking about how to deal with China, or when Trump was talking to Xi. The first, China is a tech superpower, but financially extremely fragile, right? So fragile that it could collapse. Second, that the US had a lot of leverage all by itself, simply denying market access or reputation to China from the US unilaterally could affect what was going on in China. And the third was that Xi Jinping could make concessions to the US without facing any domestic penalties. I think that was their sort of shorthand description of their opponent. All right. Is that the right description of China as the counterpart on the other side? Why don't we start? Some of this deals with economic issues and stuff. Let's start with Dan. Is that the China on the other side of the table?
Really great question. Let's see. I mean, yeah, there is tremendous financial stress in China. We've seen the bond market go into a bit of a crisis mode over the past 4 months, and lots more of that to come. A number of municipalities like Tianjin essentially going close to, we would think of it as receivership in the American context, really. They're no longer able to go to the bond market the way they had been previously. But, as long as China is willing to live without any growth or productivity, then unlike a market system where that will be marked to market and the cost will be imposed in a way that people will have to recognize, because the numbers will be there on the front page of the Wall Street Journal to show it, China will basically find a way to hide the extent of the growth slowdown that comes from the financial problems it has, to some considerable extent. We should say that it's not clear to me that China is more worried about financial stress than it is what would happen if the party showed that it was not omnipotent and able to deal with every and any eventuality. I think that's what I thought you were going to say when you boiled down the guys on the other side of the table to one term. I thought you were going to say they have to stick to their talking points and their doctrine, because that is the only glue that's keeping them on track right now. And so any dent in that would be, unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I guess I was thinking there was a lot of sense that Xi Jinping was super powerful and he could just ram through liberal reform that Lighthizer handed him to do, and he'd do it. We didn't get that, right? We
Scott,
got
I'll steal 15 more seconds from my colleagues and then I'll give it back.
Okay.
We should say that looking back to 2013, I said Xi Jinping's plan A was actually to do a lot of that reform, and that he's operating on plan B now. And that is not because he didn't try. He tried to reform the interbank market. He tried to open up the capital account. He tried to make the renminbi an international currency. He tried to delever the economy. And each time, what he discovered is that he didn't understand what was going to happen next. And so much instability started to ensue. John used the term stability kind of as a fetish and a mantra, that it caused them to lose their confidence that they knew what they were dealing with. And he had to fall back on what they do know, which is sending in the party to give people a target.
Claire and John, you all have negotiated with the Chinese on lots of different issues. How should the Biden administration view their counterpart?
Claire?
Okay. Really depends on the negotiation, right, Scott? What's relevant, but baseline. I think the Biden administration will appropriately view China as a very significant economic force. In terms of financial fragility, I think Dan makes a very good point that with China's desire for control and stability, that they don't have to have maximum growth if they can conserve that stability. So they will sacrifice that, because that's not their be all and end all by any means. And I actually have a lot of faith that China will muddle its way through on the economic side, that it has enough potential resources to muddle. Will they end up with less than optimal growth and potentially serious problems? Yeah. Will they completely collapse? I don't think so. And I think the Biden administration folks are going to come in with the idea that they won't have a kind of, yay, we're going to see the edifice crumble in the next 6 months and all will be well. They're not going to think of it that way. So that's appropriate. In terms of the amount of leverage that the United States has, I think the Biden administration has already signaled that it's clear the United States has some leverage, but it's limited. And that's why the allies are very important. And I think John and Dan have both made good points about how important the allies can be and where it is that they can and need to participate to kind of shore up a decent global system. And with regard to Xi making concessions without problems, I mean, if anyone was watching, they saw what happened even in the trade context, where what was originally teed up had to get pulled back. And that was a pretty dramatic and obvious illustration of the fact that Xi has his limits.
Thank you. John, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, the first thing I would say is that one must assume that the other side of the negotiating table has a deep distrust of American motives. They don't think that whatever we're trying to sell them is good for China. And so that you have to bear in mind. The second thing is that one of China's greatest fears is that we will, in fact, the US will work with its allies to isolate China or to box it in. And that's why you saw the comprehensive agreement on investment rushed through at the end of December with such energy by Xi Jinping. So and so that means to me that you need to, the one thing that you can offer China is a vision of a world in which there's some predictability and stability that will allow it to achieve its objectives. And to say to them, by the way, if you do the following things, that's, everything's off the table, you're heading in the wrong direction. I think they would listen to that.
That's super helpful. So I think this is really important. This is the core. So hopefully folks in the administration are giving them advice, understand China's fragile, but they're not ready to collapse. They're still got some staying power. The US has some leverage, but doesn't have all the leverage. It's constrained by the ability of it to coordinate with others. And there's certain things which we can do which make them more likely to cooperate and things that make them less likely to cooperate. I think that's really super important. Let's focus on one of those things because we got a lot of questions about our allies. And John just mentioned this, the investment agreement that the Europeans just signed. A lot of folks think that Europe shouldn't have done this, not folks in Europe, but folks outside of Europe in the US, that Europe, by doing that, gives China the advantage on the fight for the middle over the US. There's also, how much is the US going to be able to get from India at the other side, on the other side? And so how is the US going to be able to marshal these allies to support us? Should we not be worried about these deals they do with the Chinese, to build back better our alliances, as was said? What do we do here? Let's maybe Claire, could you maybe begin helping us sort of walk through how we ought to think about this contest for the middle on trade with China?
Boy, I'm not sure what you mean by the middle, Scott, but if you mean that,
everybody else.
Okay, all right. I think we have to keep our head up and look longer term at what's going on. So we have to think about this strategically. We haven't seen the EU investment agreement with China, but right now what the sort of rumors are is that it's quite a minor thing, that it doesn't actually break new ground. And frankly, China has done that to the EU on multiple occasions. That should leave the EU with a stronger sense, which we think has probably developed in the last few years, that the relationship with China is in no way cost-free, and they need to be more skeptical, which then opens the opportunities for further dialogue and hopefully trust with the EU over cooperation to create those safe harbors of actual strong trade rules and the like. So I don't view the EU as having gone off the deep end with China in any way. It's interesting that they chose to sign the agreement. I don't know if they felt it would give them more leverage with the United States. We shall see. But I think there's plenty of room with them. I think India is a very complex issue. I think India is talk about the mistrust that John talked about that, the other side would have. I think India has a congenital mistrust and skepticism about other countries, particularly other established, countries in the world who, but I think that India is also very conscious of, where the risks are with China, and there may be some things that we can do. with India that are mutually acceptable. But I think the trust issue with India and the consistency issue with India is going to be very significant, and their bandwidth is going to be a significant question as well. In terms of what we do then broadly, in terms of how we move forward, given that the Biden administration has made very clear that we are not entering into any major trade deals, that would take up a lot of bandwidth. And frankly, with Congress, it would take up bandwidth with our allies because it won't be easy. I think we have to look at more specific areas of credible, concrete problem identification, that big problems that matter, whether it's national security, economic security, technological security, or technological future. And there's lots of those that are out there in the digital sphere and in many, many other areas. So that's where I would say we move forward.
Okay. I don't know if Dan and John, you have a burning desire to weigh in on this, because I have one more question for each of you before we get to 2 o'clock. Can I switch gears a little? Okay, for Dan. Okay, renminbi. It's strong right now. China's got a big trade surplus. Doesn't look like an easy open shut case of manipulation. But what should the U.S. be thinking about in terms of the renminbi? Should we stop paying attention to questions of manipulation and start focusing on questions of digital currencies? Other types of issues, or is the renminbi question a issue that no longer deserves much attention?
Yeah, and the renminbi is strong right now because of the absence of manipulation, right? Because that's not taking place. Both trade surplus and a tremendous capital surplus right now. China's the only one in the world who's offering any yield on debt, and they need to bring in a lot of money to cover that debt, and so that's soaking up a lot of renminbi. It's making it stronger against the dollar. That has nowhere to go but down also. So over the course of 2021, the question will be, how much does the renminbi subside against the dollar, and what are the consequences of that going to be? It's really a separate issue than the one you're asking me about. But we're in this moment right now, historically, should be the great test time for China's readiness to truly be globalized. Because we think of China as a global player, but it's not. It's only a trade global player. In finance, which is where the big boys play, China hasn't even gotten out of bed yet, really. And when it does, that's going to have a big impact on the world, on American interests, et cetera. But it'll mean that they have to let the market determine what their currency's worth, rather than those same guys that want to determine everything else for all the reasons we've been talking about. So it is an incredible acid test of China's readiness to be real and to be truly global. And I don't think that they're going to just let the renminbi bounce around through 2021 according to market forces. I think we're going to see them re-intervene to put some bands around it to keep the training wheels on this economy.
Well then, it looks like Treasury Department may have a little bit more work to do than we might think, looking from right now, and traders might want to be paying attention to when the Chinese might try and pull one over on them so they don't make too much money. Let me turn to John for the final question here, which has to do with being in this new era. What's the relationship between policymakers in the Biden administration and the business, the American business community, financial community, in terms of the interaction between them? The Trump administration did meet with companies and industry, but it wasn't a very happy relationship. It was difficult, and companies, I think, from my perspective, spent most of their time hiding under the table, wanting to avoid either alienating Washington, Beijing, or both. Are we in a new era for how industry ought to be thinking about interacting with the Biden administration and this contest, or should they stay under the table?
Well, we're advising our clients to get in and assume that this is the old normal. This is we're going back to an interagency process in dealing with China. You know that if you're talking to an official, that their input will play into the policy making process. It's not all going to depend upon what Joe Biden thinks on any given moment on a particular issue. So yes, need to be in there, need to be educating this new team, and that'll pay off.
And speaking up publicly, is that also a good idea too? Or is this just about private engagement?
Well, it all depends on the issue. You know, there are some things that should be you have no choice but to address them publicly. For example, what is your footprint in vis-a-vis Xinjiang? You know, you don't have a choice in many cases to explain what you're doing or not doing there. So it really depends.
This has been a great hour. Boy, we have covered the whole landscape, and not touched every single issue, but I think the high tops of the most important mountain peaks and the biggest challenges that the Biden administration faces on China. To some extent, it's going to be about some amount of continuity, and we've seen that in the first couple of days with some of the statements that Tony Blinken and others have made. But there's also some room for change and adjustment, particularly on how we interact with our allies. But there may be more ways in which we can be creative and innovative. I would say that a year ago, when we were making predictions about 2020, I got them all wrong. We blew it. And so now, sitting at the beginning of the Biden administration, it seems like we have a relatively clear idea of which direction things are going in. But you never know. There could be some black swans, white swans, gray swans, green swans. A lot of different things could occur. Luckily, we've got Dan, Claire, John to help us navigate this complex territory. Really appreciate the three of you helping us understand these issues today. We will call on you a lot this year. I want to thank my colleagues at CSIS from the tech team from getting this up and running. My colleagues in the trustee chair, Alyssa and Scherning, for all of their great work as well. We have got a lot that in store on following China's economy, U.S.-China relations, China's tech drive, investment issues, a lot of big questions. If Washington is thinking about it, we are trying to think about it as well. So please stay tuned for programs that we're going to have in the coming months. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Cheers.